Hello, everyone. Today, we're continuing our exploration of the effects of rentier states, oil dependency, resource curves, not only on behavior of state and economy, but also on democracy. So there are basically two schools of thoughts or directions. Why is it so? Do you see anything, or I should really make it? Can you read anything? Huh, guys? This is about the plan for today. I started saying that we have, there are two directions, and one of them is study of how oil rents affect behavior of state, and it affects the growth, the economic growth, and all the other consequences coming out of that. And the other one is how oil affects democracy. So it's a relatively new area, newer than the one which studies state, behavior of state and state institutions. And we will build our today's lecture the following way. First of all, we'll try to see the major framework, which is usually connected to the name of Michael Ross. And we've already heard it. Professor Ibadoghlu told us about it in the earlier lectures, but we'll just summarize and remind again. We will have the review of rentier state theory, which assumes two approaches, that which I just mentioned, that oil rents make states less democratic, and oil rent makes government do a poor job of economic development. Then I will try to, again, remind you my favorite conceptual framework. It's about structure versus agency explanations. We will also analyze the approach by Terry Lynn Carl, which was called pacted democracy. It is a special type of bargaining and political relationship in the petrostates. And then we will eventually come to the issue whether the democratic institutions are affected by rentierism and by oil rents. And if they do, how? Then we'll, as usual, we will review both the theories which assert that it is affected, and also we'll see the others who say it is not. And in the end, I will introduce you to the study which was done by myself and my colleague from Belarus, where we're comparing the opposition as a democratic institution in two kinds of rentier states, one of which is semi-rentier, which is Belarus, and the other is just a full rentier. So again, coming back to the issue of classifying most of the approaches to explanations of resource curves and consequences for state and institutions of the rentier mechanism. I wanted to remind you that some of them say that structure, meaning objective and repeated patterns of arrangements which influences choices of individual, basically it's very hard to change them. So the choice is not free. of a politician. So you can hardly change something because there are some objective conditions which determine your choice. Sort of determinism, if you want. But there is another approach that no, actually you can, yes, actually you can change things. You can change things. It's not inevitable because it's not so strictly determined, because it's actually the matter of choice of the politician, of the leader, of the individuality. So it's not so strict, the type of economy, the rents, and it's everything, because you can actually change it. So we will see, we will apply this sort of dimensions in our analysis of the approaches to the influence of rents on the institutions, democratic institutions, including opposition. So just to remind you, Michael Ross put the question of whether oil impedes democracy, and if yes, is it true across regions? Is it just, for instance, in the Middle East, or it's also in Latin America, Africa, or any other places? Also, is it true across sectors, meaning not just the oil, but also other mineral resources? And then he mentioned the causal mechanisms. What are the mechanisms of this negative influence of oil on democracy? And roughly speaking, there were three major mechanisms: Rentier effect, repression effect, modernization effect. But I think Professor Ibadoghlu specified all these effects and sub-effects within each of them, and I think it was around 11 or maybe more. Professor Gubad, how many were they in your classification? I think it was
11.
11, yeah. So there were 11. Yeah, so you probably remember that. Again, very briefly, I'll remind you that Rentier effect does impede democracy because of the taxation effect, meaning when you have a lot of money, you don't need to tax the population, so you're not dependent on a population, which means that you are not accountable to them. And there is a less pressure from the public also to expect the accountability from you. So this connection is broken between the society, state and society. Then there is a spending effect, which will also discussed in many forums last time. And there is a group formation effect, which is basically preventing the formation of the independent from the state groups, which are very often, which are by many authors and many studies, is the basis for the democratic changes. A repression effect was very clearly seen in pre-1979 events in Iran, in Congo, 1990s, where the state spent an enormous amount of money on support of the repressive apparatus. And then, and modernization effect, it's the effect when the type of modernization prevents the labor force of entering the industrial, manufacturing, industrial, and even service sectors. Based on the big study Michael Ross studied 113 states between 1971 and 1997 to test this hypothesis. He came to conclusion, yes, indeed, oil and minerals have strong anti-democratic effects. He also concluded, as a result of this study, that oil makes greater damage to democracy in the poorer states than in the rich. For instance, if the oil rents in a big quantity start to arrive to the country, which is a low-income country, then the effect of the oil rent for the next 5 years, the prediction that it will decrease the democracy record in the country is much higher than if the money, the oil rent arrived to the country, which was already rich and high income country. He also came to conclusion that the bad effect of oil on democracy is not restricted to the Middle East, but basically is universal, universal, and is present across the regions. And we also sort of touched upon it when we were studying the effects of resource curse on state institutions. Before, so we were comparing sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. This study, which was so well presented by Terry Carl, but again, it was not about democracy. That was about state and states' institutions. So he also came to conclusion non-fuel minerals also impede democratization. And this study confirmed these three mechanisms. So what happens in the country which is oil dependent, which has dependence, which has a resource curse effects in terms of state and state institutions? They, it appeared, to also have a very special type of democratic processes or political processes. Terry Carl, on the example of Venezuela, introduced this term pacted democracy. People from the oil-rich and oil-dependent states probably can recognize this phenomenon. Very often we see that for instance, some political party of opposition gets to the parliament, not as a result of the free and fair elections, but a certain bargaining between the government and the political party. So she argues that regime change in petrostates is a result of not just simply democratic elections, although they may take place, but there is, that's a result of elite bargains and compromises in transition from authoritarian rule. This bargaining actually ensures elite survival by selectively meeting demands while limiting the scale of representation at the same time to reassure the vital interests of the dominant class to control the rest. So basically, the elite doesn't want its position of total control over resources to be challenged. That's why it selectively meets certain demands in the society and various political forces. And the pacted democracy actually reinforces the petrostate. It doesn't lead to the political liberalization, or it doesn't lead to breakthrough in the sort of institutional and democracy building, but it reinforces their petrostate. It strengthens clientelist distribution, patronage, political rent-seeking. But on the positive side, relatively speaking, it provides regime stability for a short-term period, of course. In the long run, it, as most of the Rentier effects, basically, it undermines states' administrative and technical abilities. And it creates a rigid political institutions which benefit from the status quo. So it does shape the institutions. So, for instance, in which way political parties amend their programs to expand the state by creating state-led, resource-based industrialization and fostering import substitution in the private sector. So that's how these institutions are being reinforced. The logic of petrostate is reinforced by these pacts between the government and the other political forces. So democratic administrations, regardless of party, they follow the rule of maximizing gains from the oil companies. And all policy makers, she observed it on the behavior of a few governments in Venezuela, they follow an appeasement rule, basically which is to satisfy all politically relevant social actors, and we know how, by distribution of rent, redistribution of rent. But, she says, the constituencies which were not represented via pacts were protesting in 1973. And now we are coming to an important moment, which was the basis for the other approaches, alternative approaches, which was saying that, contrary to the idea that Rentier logic is basically neutralizes opposition or prevents its emergence through buying off distribution of the rents. The other alternative approaches, they say quite opposite. Because the distribution of the rents is, as usual, unfair and unequal, it does produce opposition. We'll come to that later, but now just to continue the logic and course of speculation analysis of Terry, she was speaking about that parties became overly centralized and out of reach. Representation was inadequate, and she is basically specifying what was the reproduction of the in the institutions, which in turn caused the resistance of the society. For instance, parties were overly centralized and out of reach. Representation was inadequate. Accountability was non-existent except during election periods. And the state was inefficient and riddled with favoritism. The economy was unbalanced and skewed towards welfare consumers, highly concentrated. And then a quarter of the population was unemployed or underemployed, and half of the population lacked sewage systems and running water. That was the kind of conditions which led to the protest in the society. So you can see this is the cartoon of that period when distribution of rents is going in the hand of the small amount of cronies, and here is, on the other hand, those who are losing in this distribution of rents with the empty consumer basket. Terry Linkar says that there were few accords arranged in 1958, which, regardless of the electoral outcome, bound all main actors to the same basic political and economic program, which would guarantee the oil-led development. That's the basis of the pact. She also said that this led to the decline of trust and authority of politicians. But combination of petrostate and political pacts consolidated regime, as we mentioned it before, and for the short period of time, it helped to avoid conflicts by spending indiscriminately. But as we mentioned, it had a negative effect on state institutions, and one of which was the incentive of private sector to capture the state for their own benefits, rather than institutionalize the administrative capacity. So basically, what we're coming closer now to is the alternative approaches to the effect which rentier states have. So basically, one of these authors, Gwen Akruglik, his approach on the case study of Saudi Arabia was that the mainstream concept of rentier states is that regime stability is provided by rents via distributive role of state. And so that oil wealth can be distributed and prevent potential dissent. So there is basically very low basis for opposition and opposition parties because there is money to buy off loyalty. But he says that actually the oil wealth and rents may create opposition, but it's not the rent itself. But it does it indirectly. It's the series of policy acts. For instance, it reinforces opposition via unequal distribution of oil rents, which I mentioned before. It provides potential dissenters, the opposition members, with resources. So it also gives the resources for those who want to oppose. And then the third way is that the state strategies chosen to manage crisis has social and political consequences. So it's a matter of choice of the state. And very often the state might choose the strategies which will have the social and political consequences, not necessarily directed to the sort of pacifying the population and reconciling the interests. So he says that there are three mechanisms of dominance of the ruling elite in the society. First is distribution. We know about that, yeah, that this distribution might go through the welfare programs, social protection programs like healthcare, education, subsidies, food and energy costs, easy loans, investment incentives. The second is penetration. It's like, the families who are in power are conducting business with other major families, clans in every sector of the economy, and control all key political positions. For instance, in Azerbaijan, we basically had a hierarchy of the one family, which was sort of controlling the economy, but on the other hand, it would penetrate the society also. It's not just about control of economic business, but also intermarriages. So most of the elite would marry their sons and daughters into each other's, who also have the high positions either in economy or politics. Usually these things are merged. And they will use the radio and TV, school textbooks to foster a sense of loyalty to the public and the family. All these was researched and studied on the example of Saudi Arabia. And the third mechanism is coercion, which is that the ruling elite or ruling group, through massive intelligence apparatus, which limits freedoms and mobility, would establish sort of very limited freedoms, if at all. They would impose censorship of mail, telephones would be tapped, military intelligence would be very highly sort of financed, and National Guard and special security forces would also be very present in the society. So as a result, fear is high in the society, which also affects the self-censorship. So in the times of crisis, he says, and we come to the third point he was mentioning, that distribution may mask the dissent, yeah? But dissent is enhanced by the lower oil revenue. So once you come to the crisis, so while you have rents, you can pacify and mask the potential dissent. So for instance, some group says, you know, agricultural producers, they say we don't have enough subsidies, or we don't have enough resources, things like that. It can be given there, but it doesn't resolve the structural issue, right? The problem, because once the oil, either production or the oil price declines, dissent is enhanced, yeah, and it just comes to the surface, and also it leads to the political crisis. So it's very much of the government reaction to this political crisis and the situation which leads to the strong opposition or weak opposition. So he says that basically, we already mentioned it, that informal and inequitable use of oil rent fosters the dissent. He also says that deployment of welfare often challenges the regime's authority and legitimacy, exactly because it's done not according to the rule of law, but because of the sort of the political logic, which leaves some forces disadvantages and the other in the privileged position. So as an example, Kruglik brings various policy choices in Saudi Arabia, which are led to the series of protests from various circles in the 90s, for instance, in the basically he asserts that financial autonomy of Saudi Arabia state didn't translate into immunity from civil and social pressures. So rent failed in that case to buy loyalty of different social groups, even during the boom. They just bought temporary complacency not allocating money to a social group is as much as choice by the state as is allocating the money. So when you're allocating money to one group, this means that certain group is left without it. And because you do it selectively, right? According to the political logic, usually it's patronage. You support a small group of the cronies in exchange for loyalty. So there were a few things which the Saudi government did that time. One of them, that moving the traditional business center from Hijaz to Riyadh. Then security apparatus was created mainly based on Najdis, which resisted Al Saud when they wanted to make some reforms. Rents were deployed to religious institutions. So there was divide between the official religious leaders and the popular ones. So in the end, all these decisions which the government made, they exacerbated the protests. There is not much about this protest actually in the media. There are various reasons for that. But Saudi Arabia has been the stage of very many and quite serious protests from various groups. So with the strategy choices which the government made in the time of political crisis, it actually converged the issues of various otherwise not overlapping protest groups, social groups. And there are some common issues. It appeared to be they have common issues, like redistribution of wealth, we've spoken about that, procedural social justice, due process, the lack of accountability, convergence. Then there was a convergence of all groups demanding rule of law. And in this interpretation, the author basically asserts the primacy of agency. So he says it's a matter of choice because deployment of rent is a matter of choice. And it is affected by political goals of the one who is making these choices. These choices may distort, inhibit, accelerate political dialogue and economic growth. And fostering of opposition, as a result, is an unintended consequences of state strategies. So basically, the alternative approach to the Rentier state's effect on democracy is that how the state reacts to the crisis, boom, crisis of absorption and bust, crisis of austerity, it has specific social and political consequences. So opposition is fostered by the link between political choice, state strategies, and consequences for some social groups, not rent itself. It's basically the political acts. So unlike the original theory that state and society are separated in Rentier state, the boundaries between the state and society are fluid. And there is no automatic rentier behavior. He argues because private investors simply may not have an access to the full information. So preference for trade reflects the political reality of insecurity. And then entrance of oil rent through the mechanisms which we just mentioned, they affect identities and in the process of their formation. This approach was actually supported by the other studies too. For instance, Meliha Altunashik, she's a Turkish scholar from Middle Eastern METU, Middle Eastern Technical University, chief of the political science department. She also contributed to this theory by analyzing the Arab Spring and introducing variety of the reactions to the Arab Spring in rentier states. She basically said that of all rentier states, only 2 of them had a serious uprising. It was Bahrain and Libya, but both ended up with external interventions. In one case, it was in favor of the government, and in the other was against the government. So in the others, rentier states, limited protests didn't lead to uprising. The least turmoil was in small Gulf monarchies, the states with high income like Qatar and United Arab Emirates. Interestingly, that non-oil states, Morocco and Jordan, guarded themselves from the protests with the money of their rentier neighbors. And Saudi Arabia reacted in 2011 with a sticks and carrot approach to the protests. King Abdullah spent 130 billion subsidy program, which included increase of public sector wages, social benefits, but that was combined with the stakes, ban on the rallies, and increase of security forces presence on the streets. International factor is also important. For instance, if you look at the events in Saudi Arabia in 2012, 2013, although there were quite a large demonstrations, including formation of the new forces, new opposition forces during 2011, 2013, with the reaction I mentioned, and also support, external support. Here, as you see, John Kerry coming to visit Saudi Arabian leaders, basically says that stability is most important in this event. So we are now coming to see how the rentier economy and rentier state affects the democratic institutions, in particular political opposition. We compare 2 case studies, Belarus and Azerbaijan. We consider them both rentier states, and although they're both stable autocracies of all Eastern neighborhood, Belarus and Azerbaijan are most stable autocracies who's had the same political group in power since mid-90s. Freedom House rated them as not free regimes. Azerbaijan was partially free until 2003, I think. They're quite culturally different. Belarus is Slavic, Christian, bordering Europe. They often call it last dictatorship in Europe. While Azerbaijan is Turkic, Muslim, is periphery of European neighborhood. But they both heavily depend on rents. Okay, this is a bit of Belarus. So you can see culturally they're quite different. They're Slavic states. This is traditional kind of outfit. This is Lukashenko, this dictator who's been in power since 95. This is quite poor village life in Belarus. And this is their geography. Belarus was the first during the Second World War to face the German occupation. The photos, archival photos, contain a horrifying account of Germans, behavior of Germans on the occupied territory in Belarus. Both Wehrmacht and politicians were very, very nasty to Belarus. So, and because of that also, these are the strong memories in the mind and collective memory of the Belarusian, the former Soviet sort of functionary, Lukashenko, was utilizing these memories quite actively. So people would tolerate this quite low level of progress, economic progress, for the sake of this, what they call, we'll tolerate everything but not the war. We don't want war to repeat. This is Azerbaijan. You can see that both the landscape is different, the geography is quite different. So this is the Caspian Sea. This Azerbaijan bordering Russia, Georgia. So it's on periphery of Europe, although Azerbaijanis still consider themselves to be geographically part of Europe. They are on the margins of Europe, if it is Europe, but they border Russia, Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, and Iran. This is the old city, which has a combination of the Muslim architecture, which oil boom type of architecture, modernization symbols, the oil boom symbols of Baku. There are three fire fire towers, so-called. Fire because Baku means barbecue. The symbol of Baku are fires. It was the source of Zoroastrian culture because of the gas deposits since the very ancient times. And this is a traditional costume. And these are mountains. Mountain is part of landscape which is a bit away from Baku. Baku is located in more steppe and desert environment. And this is our dictator, Ilham Aliyev, who is the son of the former communist boss who came to power in 1993 as a result of the coup d'etat. And he laid the basis for the future petrostate. So early independence is quite similar. Azerbaijan had short period of democratic rule in 92-93. But because of the conflict with neighboring Armenia, because of the very probably radical foreign policy, it got rid of all the Soviet troops on its territory, Russian troops, and it quickly lost power in a year or so. So the old communist boss, Heydar Aliyev, came to power, and he conducted partial economic reforms. but aborted political liberalization, which was very sort of developed during the year of the Popular Front government. 53 organizations in the very short period of time were registered, so there was full freedom for registration and formation of the political and civil organizations during that period. So even whatever we have now, practically very few of them, if at all, were registered in the remaining 24 years. Most of them were registered during that 1 year of the rule of the Popular Front government. So when he came to power, he signed the major contract of the so-called major contract of the century in 1994, and oil bonuses, which he received, helped him to consolidate the rule. He established macroeconomic stability and managed to avoid certain shocks of hyperinflation, which the neighboring countries had experienced, which were poor with resources. In Belarus, Lukashenko came to power in 1995, and both economic and political reforms were halted. He decided to alternate economic restructuring with rents from Russia, subsidies in oil, gas, access to Russian markets, and with ability to abuse the rules of the game within the integration projects with Russia since 1996. So in the early 90s, well, this is 1989, the mass mobilization and protest in Azerbaijan were the highest in the old former Soviet Union. The number of people protesting by 1990 was 1 million and the square. I think at that time the population was around 7 million or 8 million, yeah. So 1 million people would come out to the major square, Maidan, as we call it, Maidan in Azerbaijani, to protest. And they even were, the photo from that square was even put on the Newsweek's cover in 1989, and the issue which was called People of the Year. So Azerbaijan and Belarus appear to have a lot in common in spite of the cultural diversity and divergence. They have a lot in common in the size, in terms of size, in terms of economy, the GDP, for instance. So they're both mid-income economies. GDP is around 75 billion. The size of population is very similar, around 9-10 million. Economic growth directly depends on, in both countries, on oil prices. The share of energy in exports is high in Azerbaijan due to some the reasons, and 60% is still high in Belarus. 60% in Belarus, 95% in Azerbaijan. But there are some differences because crude oil in Azerbaijan is 89%, so majority of exports, energy in exports is a crude oil, while in Belarus, main bulk is refined oil. So these are two countries which have both very much dependent on rent, but the resources for rents have different origin. For Azerbaijan, these are the Azerbaijan-owned internal resources, while in Belarus, the rents are coming from Russia, from the resources from Russia, and because of the reselling the refined value-added oil product, because they're getting really very cheap oil and gas from Russia based on the domestic prices. The refined oil is the main producer of hot currency in Belarus so far. So here is the table which compares Azerbaijan and Belarus. You can see a lot in common: the population, democracy score, economic growth, much higher in Azerbaijan due to the domestic energy resources. At some point, well, it was 10 in Belarus in 2006 when they had the peak of the rents from Russia. GDP, human development comparable, GDP per capita. And then if we see the expenditures, but we'll come to that later, you will see that that's where the main difference comes from. So the rent distribution, where does it come to? So the important differences between the two is Belarus economy. In Belarus economy, 70% of GDP is produced in the state sector. So it's basically socialist mixed economy. It helped Lukashenko to avoid laying off labor, avoid insider privatization, and preserved the profile of most of the enterprises from the Soviet Union. In Azerbaijan, the major bulk of GDP is produced by private sector. It's foreign oil companies. But state sector is controlled by president and his cronies. When you compare state spending, in Belarus, health spending is 40% higher than in Azerbaijan. Education spending is 2 times higher. Nominal salary is higher than in Azerbaijan. And unemployment, according to official sources, 5 times lower than in Azerbaijan. So the rents from Russia help Belarus to distribute them in the society to keep unemployment low, while income level stays relatively high. Why? Yes, and in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan's official salary is one of the lowest in the former Soviet Union. However, it's partly compensated by the informal income, what is called payment in envelopes. So the social contract between the state and society is that while not providing welfare, like in Belarus, the state leaves semi-formal avenues for income open. So they appoint you a low salary, but then it hints you that basically if you steal or if you get bribes, it's okay, you can avoid it. You can avoid punishment. Belarus was getting Belarus was getting grants from Russia besides oil and gas subsidies, also turned into welfare in exchange for public loyalty. So Belarus was distributing the oil revenues or oil rents, oil and gas rents to the broader circles of population. While in Azerbaijan, the rents from internal resources distributed in a form of patronage to the narrow group of cronies, but with open channels for informal access to resources for the rest. So basically, what the analysis which helped us to see what is in common and what is different, our approach in this analysis was based on 3 pillars. First is Rentier state theory and its effect on democracy, that rents hinder democracy. What are these mechanisms which were present in both states? It's uneven concentration of power, asymmetry of this power in distribution of political power, weak institutionalization and corruption, and missing accountability. We also used the classification of various types of rentier states. The first grade rentier state, Azerbaijan, which has the domestic resources to produce external rent. And usually the first grade rentier states, those who own the resources, their effect on democracy is more grave than the second trend state, because it has the experiencing the additional effect of resource curse or paradox of plenty. The second grade, which Belarus belongs to, second grade semi-rentier state, it doesn't have rich resources itself. It's poor with resources, but it utilizes the resources, cheap resources, which it gets from some external actors. And it distributes it to the local consumers, this rent, and also sells the value-added product abroad. And the third framework we're applying here is post-Soviet rentier state, which means we already discussed it when we were first studying the rentier state theory, that one of the schools of rentier state theory is particularly focusing on the post-Soviet rentier states, which basically is a double curse. It's a combination of the Soviet autocratic and totalitarian legacies with the elements or the effects of the resource curse. All these was applied when we were studying these two cases. So, as I mentioned, the difference between these two states is not they have divergent sources of rents. I mean, the sources of rents are, the rents are external, but the resources for the production of these rents, they have different origin. For Belarus, it's external. For Azerbaijan, it's internal. So Russia, in general, in the post-Soviet space, served as a donor for various resource-poor post-Soviet republics. For instance, it emitted currency for the non-reformed economies. bearing inflationary burden for them, negative interest credits, supplying subsidies, energy resources with prices much lower than market prices, and things like that. So this way, it's of course the political matter of political relationship, because Russia has also the huge political ambitions to keep the former Soviet Union countries under its political control. Origins of these rents are different from Russia, coming from Russia. Foreign aid, price imbalances, smuggling, barter agreements, and discounts on energy imports. In Azerbaijan, as I said, there are internal these resources, and that's why there is a presence of all three effects, which were discussed by Michael Ross. The Rentier effect, the modernization effect, and the repression effect. In Belarus, okay, let's see. First, we'll let's look at Azerbaijan and how oil rents hinder democracy. You've already heard a lot about that during the course and lectures by Professor Ibadoghlu. I will just summarize and remind certain issues which are important for our analysis of opposition. So, the share of oil rents was steadily growing since signing of the oil contract, both in exports and GDP, in spite of creation of SOFAs. In 2011, this share in exports was 92%, and tax revenue of GDPs has never exceeded 14% during the oil boom. And you remember this correlation between the taxes, the share of taxes in GDP and budget compared to the energy. So exclusive role of state in distribution of rents and a neo-patrimonial authoritarian type of regime led to the patron-client relationships. And this effect was exacerbated by Soviet legacies with non-existent institutions of checks and balances. If you remember, the study of Kazakhstan and Central Asian rentier states had stressed already this phenomenon. When the post-Soviet legacies are combined with rentier logics, they actually reinforce each other. So it doesn't help democratization. So influx of big oil in 2006 coincided with parliament basically turning into the rubber stamp, and the judicial branch became fully subservient to executive power. And that's when the big oil started to go from 2006 until 2012. And by 2018, there was no opposition left in the parliament at all. So it became a one-party parliament. Then spending effect was present there, according to the classical Michael Ross description. Rents were directed to subsidies, but interestingly enough, not to welfare, but big infrastructure and industrial mining sector, as well as repressive apparatus. In Belarus, the major trend was to adjust policies to increase rents from Russia. So Lukashenko wanted to maximize inflow of rents from Russia. And that's why he was also Soviet-based, was basing his rule on the Soviet legacies. As you remember, the Soviet legacies in the Soviet times, they were buying loyalty concessions on energy was buying sort of loyalty to Soviet Union, loyalty of Eastern Europe for Soviet Union. In Belarus, Russia was in turn appeasing, Belarus was appeasing Russia so it would get more rents originating from Russia. So there were a few sources of rents from Russia. One is oil-based rents, and that's price difference, as I already mentioned. Unlike Azerbaijan, where the huge oil refinery complex practically lost its significance, there was one in Sumgait. Belarus preserved. It's a very sophisticated and important oil refinery in Mazir. And also, its main, it became very profitable because it gave a very important revenue, the export of refined oil products to the Western markets in 2002, 2006. Export duties at that time provided 10% of its budget. My co-author, Pikulik, who was studying the effects of the Rentier effects in Belarus, calculated that it was 11% of GDP in 2006 and declined to 8% in 2008. The other source of rents is gas-based rents. So there were very generous discounts on gas from Russia, with interest 20-25%. Was added by Lukashenko, the Belarus leader, to the local customers when he was selling it to the local customers. The third rents were coming from the transit fees for oil and gas transportation via Belarus territory. So gas-based rent together were 12% of GDP in 2006 and 9% in 2008. So, as we mentioned, back to Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan had internal resources of rents. Proven reserves 7 billion barrels of oil, it's 0.04% of the world reserves, and 1.1 trillion cubic meters of gas. 0.6%. In 2012, share of exports was 96.2% and 73.1% of the budget. And in 2014, the energy revenues constituted 66% of the budget. So economies' high dependence on oil and even construction and transport sectors were indirectly funded by the oil economy. Much of private sector depends on government contracts from the public investment. Azerbaijan failed to diversify economy, and major investment still goes to the industrial sector, supporting oil and gas production, and corruption has increased. Professor Ibadoghlu is an author of a few very important publications revealing, based on mirror statistics, of shortages of imports, the degree of corruption and shadow economy. So one of his publications shows that $1.6 billion shortage was discovered in imports in 1 year only, 2015, from trade with 3 states, Russia, Georgia, and Turkey. And share of agriculture dropped from 16 in 2000 to 5 in 2013. The next question, which brings us closer to the issue of opposition, is who controls the rents? In Azerbaijan, it's highly centralized political power with legislative and judicial branches subordinated to executive, the president, and which enjoys support of small group of ministers, oligarchs, and cronies, which were ex-colleagues, relatives, people from the same region. With the decline of the oil production and oil rents, respectively, as well as the drop of the oil price, world oil price, there were some changes in behavior of the president, who decided to basically get rid of the oligarchs, and now is replacing them by the technocrats, young technocrats, with very limited opportunities for enrichment and misappropriation of funds. Control over over oil is based on the decree on state oil companies, which gives the monopoly over management of oil industry. Production sharing agreements give exclusive rights to the president, and the interesting thing is that each production sharing agreement is being adopted by the parliament given the force of law. So it creates the vested interest of everyone who signed it, instability of the political power in Azerbaijan. So this, in the other countries, for instance, PSAs or contracts are regulated by one law on investments or something like that. But here in Azerbaijan, you have each PSAs adopted by the parliament. He also created the Presidential Reserve Fund, something, and Heydar Aliyev Foundation, something which exists also in Belarus. So in Belarus, in national referendum in 1996, president got the opportunity to rule by a decree, and also the opportunities for the state bodies to be financed in the non-transparent way. He created so-called presidential fund, where the money from oil sector, gas, barter, and illegal smuggling were accumulated, and then distributed further to finance certain public projects. But these resources were allocated not so much for enrichment, because the type, Lukashenko is a type of leader who was more interested in his rating and popularity than the enrichment. So both countries had the classical sort of effect, which is called repression effect. For instance, in Azerbaijan, there was one of the highest growth rates among expenditures on judiciary, law enforcement, from 2011 to 2016. An annual average rate was 30%. It was parallel to the sort of in 2011, 2006. And you see basically the behavior of the police is very similar in Belarus. Belarus is here and Azerbaijan is there. And now we come to that's where the agency enters our analysis. So why Azerbaijan, So basically you have very similar countries with the Rentier. Both of them are Rentier, with some difference that Azerbaijan has domestic resources and Belarus produces rents on the difference of prices from Russia energy and local, and then sold abroad. Azerbaijan distributes rents in a classical clientelistic patron-client type of scheme, the form. So billions of dollars were directed to the presidential and close to him circles. Welfare represents very insignificant share of rent distribution. In Belarus, it's the other way around. Lukashenko was generous on welfare. And the question is why? Well, there is the factor which might explain why is it different. So Belarus, first of all, is a semi-rentier state and free from resource curse. There is less pressure of associated structural justification of neo-patrimonial framework as best for patron-client relationship. But many post-Soviet states have rent-seeking elites, not only energy-rich. So the idea is that it is regime change and nature of power which defines different ways of distribution of resources. The point is that Lukashenko came to power as a result of relatively free and fair elections, with 47.7% of votes in the first tour and winning Kebic, his competitor, in the second tour. He had, in addition to winning the getting popular legitimacy, he had a Soviet ideology, appealed to the sentiments related to the World War II, as we mentioned, and Soviet era symbols. Alieva came to power in 1993 as a result of the coup d'etat, with obviously a fake percentage, 98.7%. But he couldn't appeal to the same values, which were not popular in Azerbaijani society, and also were not welcomed by Western investors, the Soviet symbols and others. He had this vague slogan, population stability, development and stability, which was supposed to satisfy both domestic audience and the foreign investors. But he couldn't appeal to the same symbols as in Belarus because of difference of the society, really. And due to the decline of oil prices in 2015, which caused protests in 14 regions of the country, it led to increased welfare in the share of welfare in 2016 budget. So basically it also corresponds to the, if you remember, we discussed one study, why certain oil dictators are more generous to the public than the others. And one of the factors researched was that if there is a pressure of the possible revolt or rebellion, particularly on the more leftist sort of type of rebellion, then they may become more sort of generous in terms of welfare, rather than putting everything in the pockets of themselves and their cronies. So the other things you probably are well familiar. What is important in all that, and where we were leading, is that this type of economy was leading to the declining number of independent from state economic groups due to further centralization of the economic power, extending number of state employees, repressions against small and medium businesses, especially those who dared to finance the opposition. This was happening both in Belarus and Azerbaijan. There was this famous, it was even tougher in Belarus because people simply would be killed, the businessmen who were giving money to the opposition, like Krasovsky, if you remember, in the early 2000s, I think he disappeared. But then the person who worked in the intelligence, he basically witnessed, he told the story that he was killed. So the businessmen who dared supporting the opposition, they were killed. In Azerbaijan, they get really long terms in prison. One of them, I think, I don't know if he was released recently, but he got quite 10 or 15 years in prison. Opposition didn't. The other thing is that, so poverty, and other factors, they contributed to narrowing down financial and economic basis of opposition in Azerbaijan. Opposition didn't accept foreign money due to the out of principle, because they considered the opposition should be supported by the domestic finances. And also it was prohibited by law. Unlike in Belarus, there was a huge, the opposition would not refuse the foreign money. And some parties got funding through NGOs, but after crackdown on civil society, this source was cut too. That crackdown on civil society was in 2014. And that was one of the reasons why I had to move to the West, because I was one of those NGOs who suffered, as well as Professor Ibadoghlu. In 2016, the biggest opposition party in Azerbaijan had only one staff on salary. And of course, this was accompanied by the parallel legal and political restrictions. So now we come to the other very important asset, that, as we know, in the former Soviet space, the pro-Western stance of opposition may be a very valuable and important asset in the activities and building of the opposition. In case of Azerbaijan, as opposition took pro-Western course on liberal reforms, it was all right. But then when the communist bosses came, they utilized oil resources to attract the Western interest. And you could watch and observe how the pro-Western stance of opposition was losing its importance, because it had nothing to offer in terms of material gains for the Western actors, while the government also had a pro-Western cause, but it was in terms of providing their energy interests. So the government was distributing shares, generously distributing shares in the oil contracts in the West. So the opposition could not compete with the government in terms of its pro-Western cause. So in case of Azerbaijan, pro-Western stance was not an asset. So in a sense, the government hijacked an ally from Azerbaijani position. Domestically, opposition targeted authoritarianism, repressions, corruption, social injustice, and Karabakh issue. But links with Europe were also weak. And it's not only funding, but even the contacts and integration at the level of the parties and civil society was quite weak, because the European politicians didn't want to upset the government by these contacts. The stakes were higher for them because they were afraid if they meet with opposition leaders during their visits, they might be deprived or lose in competition to Chinese and Russian companies in terms of getting the share in the and you probably remember that Maggie Thatcher came to Baku in 1992, not because it was very fascinated by the liberal course of the young democratic leaders who came to power in Azerbaijan Popular Front government, but because she was lobbying for BP, and was BP, which was very much eager to get into the as a primary actor in Azerbaijani. So this is attempt of the Orange Revolution in Azerbaijan. It's very interesting that people at this meeting are holding slogans in English, and they appeal to Mr. Bush, don't lose a friendly Muslim country. It didn't help either. And if you look, you will see that with the development of petrostate, starting from 1994, you remember this 1 million wise demonstration in Azerbaijan, something which was mobilized by political opposition. And this is what was left by the middle of 2000s. There are a couple of young people trying to protest, and each of them had the police on them. So probably observing these trends help us to quite vividly understand what was happening with the gradual logic of rentierism happening in Azerbaijan and its effect of democratic mobilization and capacity to mobilize the population for protests. In case of Belarus, rents were used by Lukashenko to sustain his social contract with broader population, as I already said. Welfare pushed opposition to the margins, as opposing Lukashenko meant opposing the welfare status quo. So opposition, because Lukashenko was offering up welfare, Lukashenko was offering welfare and was distributing welfare. The opposition had to offer the privatization and blood and tears, sweat and tears of the sort of competition. So it was, of course, as compared to welfare, was less attractive, particularly when people observed already the experience of internal privatization and all sorts of injustice which was happening in the neighboring countries like Russia or any other countries. So three factors, peculiar stresses of weakness of opposition. It's limited space of activities which push them, the opposition, towards online activities at the expense of offline. Then dependency of the opposition on the West donor implementer networks, and paradox situation. Harsh repressions led to greater funding, while the dialogue led to less funding. So there was a very interesting dynamic of the opposition, who was, when it was interested in maximizing the funds coming from the donors, Western donors, it had to be really confrontational with the government. And so basically, if we conclude, we will say that our study basically confirmed that rentier states indeed were united by structural impediments for democracy through the effects which were described by classics of political economy of rentier states. But in such case, the change may emerge in political momentum promoted by the decline of the oil prices. So when the most recent decline of oil price came, Alieva came up with a quite unusual proposal of dialogue with opposition just this year. He found the other way to address the issue of decline of the oil price. He distracted the attention by the war with neighboring Armenia, but there were quite objective sort of conditions for that, of course. But so in Azerbaijan, the distribution of rents driven by the oil-based economy and leaders' power base during the transition of power was going through informal patronage networks and the repressive apparatus rather than welfare system. So it was exclusionary patronage. And opposition had low level of support from the West. Belarus opposition, in contrary, enjoyed high support from the West. It had $0.5 billion spent on opposition since 1998, $500 million the West has spent. And the opposition had to fight a very unusual enemy, benevolent, inclusive autocracy, which was somewhat popular in the society until recently. We're now watching the big protests, which are not arranged by the political opposition. It's rather the factor of the virtualization of the politics and the role in leadership, the role of networks. So, okay. We did see the both structural and agency factors in the effects of rentier states on opposition. We discovered that there are differences in these effects in case of semi-rentier states and full rentier states. So Azerbaijan, which started as a country with the highest mobilization of the population in protests and the most powerful and strongest opposition in the whole former Soviet space, with the logic, with the influx of the oil rents, it ended up in the highly authoritarian regime with very little space for dissent and protest and very weak opposition. In case of Belarus, we had a very similar development, but we did have the huge support from the West, the opposition, which was basically functioning thanks to the finances of the West, but these also justified or conditioned its weakness. This dependence on the donor dependence. Let me just stop here. And first of all, I would love to see if you have any questions. If not, then I will ask you questions. You are only, how many of you are here? 3. Okay, there is no way we can divide in groups. Yes, Professor Ibadoghlu, you wanted to say something?
No, I am listening.
Yeah, okay. So my questions are, do you agree that oil hinders democracy? It's the first question. Who wants to answer? Okay, so here we have a question. Impacts of nationalism. Do leaders make? We will speak about this next time. Well, our last lecture topic is our last day of lecture is resource nationalism as a phenomena which affects the behavior, the foreign policy of the state. Domestically, nationalism, we do have the issue of provoking or promoting nationalism non-related to oil. It's the war with Armenia. It has nothing to do with oil. So unresolved conflict with Armenia always creates a political capital and possibility of utilization of this capital of nationalist sort of sentiments, unresolved conflict in the politics and economics. So as I said, we will speak on resource nationalism next time. But here we deal with, in Azerbaijan, and currently the nationalism card is used due to the unresolved conflict with Armenia. Yes, so my good question. Yes, it is a rent curse and not a resource curse. Yes, and that's what I said in the beginning, that the prospect for democracy in Azerbaijan are more grave than in Belarus, because Belarus has only rent curse, as you just mentioned, and Azerbaijan has double curse of the resources which are at its disposal, and it has a greater confidence in a sense of these resources. Because with Russia, in relations with Russia, you have to be really very adaptable and alert, because these are not your resources. You depend on the external actor. Okay. So what's your impression? I'll ask you just one question. If you were the leader of opposition in the Rentier state, what would be your priority? What you would be watching most? And I would love to hear any of you. Maybe I should start with Charlie. Charlie, what would you do if you were a leader of opposition in the Rentier state?
It's It's a challenge. I mean, in Timor-Leste, the democracy is still functioning, so there are opposition politicians in parliament. That the prime minister changes from party to party as you go from year to year. So, I guess as a leader of the opposition, I would organize grassroots people and try to win the next election. That's what people do.
Okay, but do you think you will have a particular type of obstacles which are different from the other states? For instance, in rentier states, what kind of particular obstacles which require greater attention, and how would you adjust your strategy or tactics to that?
Well, the obstacle is that the government has a lot of money, which comes from oil and gas extraction and doesn't come from taxes or from the public. And so there's a sense that the money belongs to the leaders. It doesn't belong to the people, even though the resources, obviously, according to the Constitution, belong to the people. So the challenge is to overcome the network of cronyism and favors and patronage that whichever government is in power is able to distribute. It's interesting now, there's a new party in power and they just appointed a new minister of petroleum and a new head of the regulatory authority and a new head of the National Oil Company. And they talked for a little while about changing the direction of investing more and more money in oil-related infrastructure that's probably going to lose money. But as it gets closer to actually doing it, they're not, they're backing away from that position and they're sort of continuing the policies of the previous government. Probably because the patronage networks from the oil money are too strong to resist, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
Interesting, because for Azerbaijani opposition, the major problem, it appeared to be, they were very naive. First of all, they never took into account the Rentier mechanism, and they didn't know actually that oil affects and makes the prospect for democracy worse. And they were relying on the Western support. They were relying on the West officials. And that was the biggest mistake. I mean, they had to become more sober, more realistic, and understand that it's not the official circles of the Western states, but rather international human rights organizations, you know, some countries, special countries who always are consistent in the international organization, like some Scandinavian countries, for instance, or the group countries, which are, they would very naively expect the support from the democratic official Western states, although, you know, the government hijacked that ally because of the oil contracts. And I wonder whether the similar thing was happening in Timor-Leste, no?
Not so much. I mean, when you say the Western states, I think you mean the United States primarily, which has an allergy to any kind of state-owned industry, which is, I think, why they're intervening in Azerbaijan. And we can see that it very rarely works out. I mean, Venezuela is the classic case of where U.S. intervention has not achieved its goals and has only made the situation worse. I'm not sure that it's naivete. I think there's some, and there was an article in the New York Times yesterday about how, quote, pro-democracy leaders in China and other parts of Asia are regretting the end of the Trump administration because they like Trump better than Biden, because his bigotry and his pro-Christian or anti-Muslim, anti-anything that's not Christian bias supported their goals. But I think opposition leaders and opposition citizens in these countries need to understand the U.S. does not do things for ideological or for principled reasons. The U.S. has its own agenda, and they need to be very careful in taking support from the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually meant the European states as well, because the European Union is, in a sense, trying to help the countries in its neighborhood, not so much because of the democracy, but because of the prosperity, as they call, they need to have prosperity and stability on their borders. But they invest in the reform process. They try to invest. Azerbaijan was the lowest in terms of per capita aid from European Union. Thank you so much, Ali. That's very interesting. Samaya, you seem to, if you were the leader of opposition in Iran, what would you particular sort of address, or what you would make the priority, how to overcome the priority obstacle in the rentier state?
From my point of view, the best strategy is to have a freedom to people. And also transparency is very important in every country. And in this way, all of the leaders can follow their goals, and also they can have support of their people.
What about financial support of your party? For instance, you're a leader of the opposition party, and where would you get finances? They arrest everyone who is giving money to opposition. The law doesn't allow accepting money from West or foreign states. People are too poor to give donations or pay membership fee. Where would you get money for the party?
Oh.
That's a tough question. I don't know, maybe Jokai knows. Jokai, where would you get money for your political opposition party?
Basically, I think Burma and the democratic movement, like Aung San Suu Kyi's party, we used to get a lot of funding from the West, from the US, and then from the EU. And then, for the questions, as an opposition leader, I mean, that's thinking. But a lot of money is come from the oil and gas and mineral, and also foreign aid. Mm-hmm. So probably need to call for the stop kind of aid to throw into the government's pocket.
Okay. Any other challenge you would think of addressing if you were the political party leader, opposition leader? Besides financing, I mean, if financing is possible to get from foreign sources, but you already mentioned that it might lead to extreme dependency, as in case of Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a little home task for you to think about it. A worker will not accept grants. Interesting. That's interesting. Good. Mm. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, Charlie. Yeah, I agree. I know, Professor Gubad. Hi, Jokai, you wanted to say something? Or, I know that Professor Ibadoghlu is very experienced in both oil sort of revenue management and opposition activities. So if you could share your views and comments, maybe you have comments on this.
Yeah, of course. The oppositions during the oil boom really suffered from the increasing of the repression, because we talk about some of the effect of the natural resources. One of them, the repression, because the government became more powerful. Government spent more money for the modernization of the police, modernization of the law enforcement, modernization of the special service system. They also made more investment for the surveillance of the politics opponents, and it really was very difficult for the secular opponent to operate because they was under the control, they was under the surveillance, they was also under the press by the government. In this case, one of the main maybe task for the opposition to mobilize more resources. I mean, more the human resources from the population side, because population also every time when the price is going up, when the revenue is going up, the expectation also is going up. They expected more also wage, more also social payment. Unfortunately, it's impossible to spend more money for the militarization, the more money for the special service system, and to increase budget of the law enforcement and the court and other the institution. At the same time, also increase the budget for the social payment, budget for the also wage for the civil servant. It's not impossible because the more money the government allocated for its own the security issues. In this case, most people are not satisfied with this situation. I think the opposition should mobilize more supporters. As for the civil society organization, unfortunately, during all time independence of our country, the civil society organization depend on the foreign funding, and never we think about our own funding and the membership fee, and also work with the private sector, and also produce some service, some goods to make the additional revenue for the civil society organization. The 95, 99, sometimes the 100% of the non-governmental organization depend on the foreign funding. I think it's not the right policy for the civil society organization because there is no diversification of the funding. It's not sustainable. But the same happened in Azerbaijan in 2014. It was the crackdown of the civil society organization. The government banned the funding from the abroad, and all of the independent non-governmental organization already suspend their activities because all of them depend on the foreign funding. But we should also, as a civil society organization, we should develop the plan for the sustainability of the funding, for the diversification of the funding. In contrary, impossible to operate the long-term period, because one day the government banned it. The government also created the barrier for the access for foreign funding. And Charlie has a comment in Timor-Leste. The government used oil money to fund many civil society organizations. Does this happen elsewhere? But in Azerbaijan, the oil, the small, maybe the council for the support NGO based on the budget support. They have this small budget around 2-3 billion annually, $2-3 billion, $2-3 million, not billion dollars. They allocated for the support of the civil society. I think it's not directly the oil money, but it's if we take the budget base 60% of the oil money, and the budgets also transfer $2-3 million every year to the State Council for Support NGO, and the State Council for Support NGO in Azerbaijan responsible for the distribution this money among the pro-governmental, non-governmental organization. We are talking the Congo government orientation, the non-governmental organization. But we can say that there is the oil money, but oil money that they distribute among the pro-governmental, non-governmental organization, but not the independent non-governmental organization.